Hi everyone, this is Ms. Romani. For today's lesson, we will begin our exploration of the six classes of nutrients by focusing on carbohydrates. For the past few years, it seems that many people are becoming more and more focused on carbohydrates, or carbs, and the focus seems to be on trying to avoid them as much as possible. So, what are carbohydrates? Well, here's a short quiz. Which of these three pictures of foods contain foods that are high in carbohydrates? It was a trick question. All three of these pictures contain high carb foods. But of course, these three piles contain very different types of foods. So obviously, not all carbs are nutritionally equal. During this lesson, we will explore carbohydrates at a molecular level, but we will actually mostly focus on understanding why certain types of carbs are nutritionally better and better for our health than others. So at a molecular level, carbohydrates are molecules made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And as I mentioned, they are most commonly known as carbs. But another word that we use to describe them is sugars. We eat carbs for energy. That is their main function in our bodies, to provide our bodies with energy that we will use immediately or that we can store for the short term, like say for a few hours, maybe a day. Our brain in particular is very good at using carbs for energy. When we eat foods that are high in carbohydrates, like for example breads and pastas that are high in starch, they can be digested into glucose by our digestive system. The glucose then gets absorbed into our bloodstream and enters our cells, and there it is used as a fuel via a process called cellular respiration, which we won't get into in this course. But the point is that we mostly use these molecules of sugar called glucose to produce the energy our cells need to do their jobs and to keep us alive. And now we need to produce and use energy constantly, but we obviously can't be consuming sugars 24/7, no matter how much we might love that. So our cells need to find a way of storing the sugars that we eat and digest so that we can use them throughout the day for energy. And we have a way of doing just that. In our liver and our muscle cells, we can form bonds between glucose molecules, making a large molecule called glycogen. And just like a car has a gas tank that can store gasoline, our liver and muscle cells can serve as glucose gas tanks, storing glucose as glycogen for when we need more fuel. And so then when our blood sugar is low and we need more sugar for energy, the bonds in glycogen are broken and glucose is released into our bloodstream or directly into our muscle cells. In humans, sugars are not meant to be stored for long periods of time. First, we use up the glucose that is in our bloodstream. And once that runs out, we can add more sugar to our blood by breaking up the glycogen stored in liver and in muscle cells into glucose. Most of us have enough glycogen storage in our muscle and liver cells that, if completely filled with glycogen, can store glucose that can give us energy for maybe 12 to 24 hours of regular activity or 1 to 2 hours of exercise, depending on the intensity of the exercise. But after we've used up all our sugar that is stored in glycogen, our blood sugar levels will drop and we won't be able to bring them back up because we won't have any stored glycogen to do that anymore. So we will start to feel very tired and hungry, which will then prompt us to consume more sugar, and that will bring our blood glucose back up. If we don't eat sugars though, our body will then start to burn fats as a source of energy instead. The premise of low carb diets or intermittent fasting is based on this. In low carb diets, glycogen stores are kept low by not consuming enough carbs to fill them. And in intermittent fasting, food is not consumed for at least 12 hours, depleting all glycogen stores. Both of these force our bodies to break down fat as an energy source. Now, we've briefly touched upon three types of carbs here: glucose, starch, and glycogen. But let's take a closer look at these and other carbohydrates and their categories. Carbohydrates are mainly divided into three chemical classes based on the size of the sugars, or more specifically, the number of single sugar molecules that are in each molecule. They are the monosaccharides, the disaccharides, and the polysaccharides. The monosaccharides are single sugar molecules. The word monosaccharide actually means one sugar, the prefix mono meaning one, and the suffix saccharide meaning sugar in Latin. And there are three different monosaccharides in the food that we eat: glucose, which we already talked about a bit, galactose, and fructose. So, a few minutes ago, we learned that when we eat carbs, the larger carb molecules of starch are broken down in our digestive system into the monosaccharide glucose. And that is true of all sugars. The digestion of sugar is about breaking them down into these three monosaccharides. But if we were to consume foods that contain glucose or fructose or galactose, then those sugars would not need to be broken down at all and they would be absorbed immediately into our bloodstream. Foods that contain these sugars, like, say, corn syrup or candy or fruit or honey, will raise our blood sugar immediately and will be available for energy right away. The disaccharides are double sugar molecules, the prefix di meaning two in Latin. There are three different disaccharides in the food that we eat. Sucrose, which is made of a glucose bonded to a fructose and is the sugar found in table sugar. Lactose, which is a glucose bonded to a galactose and is the sugar found in milk. And maltose, which is two glucose bonded together and is often a sugar used to make beer. Like monosaccharides, disaccharides can be absorbed immediately into our bloodstream because our bodies only have to break a single bond in order for these sugars to be absorbed. So, foods that contain these sugars also raise our blood sugar levels immediately and are available for energy right away. Both the disaccharides and monosaccharides are then called simple sugars or simple carbohydrates or simple carbs. The other category of sugars are called the complex carbohydrates. They are the polysaccharides, poly meaning many in Latin. So the term means many sugars, and they are basically long chains of glucose. There are three types of polysaccharides in our diet. However, starches is the main one that we consume. Foods that are high in starches are potatoes, cereals, breads, pasta, rice, and basically any other grain. The reason that these plant products are high in starch is because plants store their glucose as long molecules of starch. And some plants, like, say, potatoes, store much of their starch in their roots, and other plants, like the grain, store lots of their starch in their seeds. Because the starch molecules are made up of many, often hundreds of glucose molecules whose bonds need to be broken during digestion, it takes a bit longer for glucose to enter our bloodstream when we consume starch than when we consume simple sugars. While starch is the storage polysaccharide in plants, glycogen is the storage polysaccharide in animal cells. We store extra glucose from our diet as glycogen and break it down into glucose as needed throughout the day. And glycogen is not really a sugar we consume, it is mostly a sugar that we make. However, since other animals also store glycogen in both their liver and their muscle cells, eating meats can provide us with some glycogen sugars from the glycogen that was stored in those cells. And like I said earlier, on average, glycogen can store glucose in our liver and in our muscle cells for up to 12 to 24 hours of regular activity or 1 to 2 hours of intense exercise. And this is a range, and any individual's ability to store glycogen may fall within that range or be lower or be higher than that. Athletes, especially endurance athletes like marathon runners, cyclists, or triathlon competitors, rely on glycogen stores to get them through their long races. During a race, their bodies burn through the glucose in their blood very quickly, so they have to rely on their glycogen stores for energy. When their glycogen stores become depleted, their bodies can, of course, turn to fat as a source of energy. But although fat can store a lot of energy, getting the energy from fat is way less efficient than getting the energy from sugars. And as a result, when glycogen stores are empty, athletes sometimes feel a drop in energy during the race, sometimes referred to as hitting the wall. So, athletes can actually improve their glycogen stores prior to a big race through training and eating in a way that maximizes glycogen storage. This is a process sometimes referred to as carb loading or glycogen loading because it involves eating a lot of carbs right before race day. So, a lot of people have actually heard about carb loading. For example, in the Fun Run episode of the show The Office, Michael Scott decides to carb load by eating a huge portion of fettuccine alfredo 5 minutes before a 5K run, which just goes to show that even though people may have heard about carb loading, that doesn't mean they really know how to do it. or even when it is appropriate to do it. To start, it is unnecessary for a 5K run or any race shorter than a full marathon, and it really should only be done under the supervision of a trainer and following a proper process. For example, studies in the 1960s showed that athletes can substantially increase their muscle glycogen stores by doing a long workout, like, say, a very, very long run, 7 days before a competition, then eating a low carbohydrate diet for 3 days, followed by a high carbohydrate diet or a carb load for 3 days preceding the race. So, what ends up happening is that the long run, 7 days before the race, depletes the body's glycogen stores. And then the 3 days of low carbohydrate intake keeps them low, which signals the body to store as much glycogen as possible when the carbo load phase starts. The downside of this process is that during the carbohydrate depletion phase, the athletes will experience irritability, weakness, and a lowered immune system, which is not great when you're getting ready for a big race. So, current studies are showing that this approach, especially the extreme depletion phase, is not always necessary to ensure that glycogen stores are full prior to a race. And current training methods are a little bit more detailed and more varied, and often tailored to the sport and to the individual athlete. So, let's move on to the third polysaccharide, cellulose. Unlike starch and glycogen, which are storage polysaccharides and are used to store extra glucose for plants and animals, cellulose is a structural polysaccharide. Its role is to make up the strong cell walls of plant cells. And just like the other polysaccharides, cellulose is made up of long glucose chains. However, it uses a slightly different version of glucose, one that humans can't digest. Now, some animals can actually digest cellulose, in particular the herbivores like, say, cows and sheep. But we can't. We just don't have the enzymes to break the bonds between the glucose molecules in cellulose. So, what's interesting about cellulose is that despite the fact that we can't digest it, meaning that it basically goes in one end and out the other without being absorbed into our bloodstream at all, a diet that is high in cellulose is extremely important for optimal health. Now, cellulose is usually just called fiber, and that's probably how you've heard it referred to before. And diets that are high in fiber, like for example whole grains and fruits and vegetables and seeds, have many different health benefits. Dietary fiber comes in two forms: soluble and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber, as the name implies, can be dissolved in water and turns into a gel, which makes you feel full and slows down the absorption of sugars into the bloodstream. Both of these things reduce the risk of obesity and diabetes. Now, some foods with soluble fiber include oatmeal, yams, beans, and avocados. Insoluble fiber does not absorb water. It moves quickly through your intestines and provides something called roughage, which helps keeps us regular. Insoluble fiber also lowers the risk of heart disease and certain cancers. Insoluble fiber is found in whole grains, in nuts, in lentils, in flax seeds, and crunchy fruits and vegetables. So, as you can see, fiber is the most important carbohydrate for optimal health. So, when choosing carbohydrates to include in your diet, you want to look for those that are less processed and those that are higher in fiber. Not only is the fiber in these foods healthy, but foods that are high in fiber will often also contain more vitamins and minerals as well. For example, the bread on the left is a highly processed white bread, and the bread on the right is a less processed whole grain bread with flax seeds. Both have equal amounts of carbohydrates per serving. However, the whole grain bread has more fiber and more vitamins and minerals, making it a much healthier choice. Now, let's say you're going to be picking an after school snack. Between this cookie and this apple, the healthier choice is obviously the apple. But that's because even though both of these foods have an equal amount of carbohydrates, the apple has 10 times the amount of fiber as the cookie. The apple also has way more vitamins and minerals, making it the obvious healthier choice for an after school snack. So, obviously, not all foods that are high in carbs are equal. And a lot of it comes down to how these different foods affect both our blood sugar levels and our ability to regulate those levels using hormones. So when we eat carbohydrates, either as polysaccharides or disaccharides, different enzymes will digest them down to their component monosaccharides. These single sugars will then get absorbed from our small intestine into our bloodstream, which causes our blood sugar levels to rise. But the point is actually not to keep these sugar in our bloodstream, but actually to get these sugars into our cells, where it can be used to provide our cells with energy. This is accomplished by a hormone called insulin. But for now, let's focus on this first part of the graph and talk about how different types of foods can actually affect the speed at which our sugar levels rise. And so to quantify this, we can use a ranking system called the glycemic index. And the glycemic index is a scale from 1 to 100 that ranks different foods based on the speed at which they raise blood sugar levels. In other words, the speed at which the sugars in our food are broken down into monosaccharides like glucose and absorbed into our bloodstream. Foods with a glycemic index higher than 70 are considered to have a high glycemic index because they cause a strong and rapid change in blood sugar levels. High glycemic index foods include many of the foods that we consider to be junk foods and that are highly processed. Foods like high sugary pops, candies and cakes and cookies, and juices with added sugar, as well as white breads and potatoes, are considered to be high glycemic foods. And eating many high glycemic index foods can lead to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes or heart disease, and of course, obesity. So, foods with a glycemic index below 55 are considered to be low GI foods and cause blood sugar levels to change gradually and in moderation. And that is because the sugars that contain are digested slowly and absorbed slowly. Many of these foods have lots of fiber, which can slow down sugar absorption, or have a lower carbohydrate and a higher protein and or fat content. So, for example, foods like beans and lentils, nuts and seeds, as well as many fruits and most fresh vegetables, have a low glycemic index because they are high in fiber. These low GI foods can control appetite and they can delay hunger, which is great for weight control. And diets that are rich in these types of foods can help control insulin production and prevent something called insulin resistance, which is the cause of type 2 or adult onset diabetes. So, speaking of insulin, now that we've discussed how different foods affect our blood sugar levels, let's talk about the hormones that affect the blood sugar levels, like, for example, insulin, which lowers our blood sugar. There are actually two main hormones that control our blood sugar levels: insulin and glucagon. Both are produced by special cells in the pancreas. But even though both are produced by the pancreas, they have opposite effects on blood sugar levels. One of them raises blood sugar levels, and the other one lowers blood sugar levels. So let's start with glucagon. Glucagon is released into your bloodstream whenever blood glucose levels are low. So, for example, right after exercise or if it's been a while since you ate a meal. Glucagon then travels to the liver and to the muscle cells and causes the breakdown of glycogen into glucose. The glucose is then released into the bloodstream, which raises our blood sugar levels. Of course, this process can only work if there actually is glycogen stored in the liver and in the muscle cells. If all the glycogen stores have been depleted, then glucagon will be unable to raise blood sugar levels. On the other hand, when blood sugar levels are already high, we use a hormone called insulin to move the sugar out of the bloodstream and into our cells. So what your body needs is it needs to remove the sugar out of your blood so that it can use that sugar in your cells for energy. And insulin essentially acts like a key that binds to receptors on the cell membrane and then signals a bunch of glucose transporter proteins to travel to the cell membrane where they act as doorways, transporting the glucose into the cells. And like I said, insulin acts like a key that essentially lowers blood sugar levels by letting glucose into your body cells. And without insulin, without that key, glucose can't get into our body cells. If that happens, the sugar will not be able to be used for energy, and blood sugar levels will remain high, causing a whole bunch of issues that are associated with a disease called diabetes. And people with type 1 diabetes or juvenile diabetes, essentially have lost the ability to produce these keys. They have lost the beta cells in their pancreas that produce insulin, and they're unable to make any insulin. On the other hand, people with type 2 diabetes or adult onset diabetes can actually make insulin, but the body cells are unable to use the key. They're unable to use the insulin properly to let the glucose in. So even though there is insulin produced, the key does not work that well, and the glucose cannot get into the cells properly. Some glucose may still get in, but not all of it does, which keeps the blood sugar levels high. These high blood sugar levels associated with diabetes can be very dangerous for the body and can result in many complications, including blindness, strokes, heart attacks, kidney failures, and even leg amputations. And this is due to the damage that these high blood sugar levels causes the blood vessels in our bodies. It has sadly been estimated that 1 in 3 Canadians today have either diabetes or prediabetes, which means that they will develop type 2 diabetes if they don't change their lifestyle choices. And even though type 1 diabetes is not preventable, type 2 diabetes is very much preventable because it is often caused by poor diet and by a lack of exercise. And so the best way to prevent type 2 diabetes is by improving our blood sugar control through a diet that is low in simple carbohydrates and low in high glycemic index foods in general, as well as high in fiber and other low glycemic index foods. When we eat low glycemic index foods, the sugar in those foods is absorbed into our bloodstream at a slow and gradual pace, which then causes insulin to be released at an equal and slow pace. And so, for example, in this graph, you can see that the amount of insulin released is just enough to bring the blood glucose levels back up to that optimal point in our blood. You can see that right there in the orange line in the graph. If, on the other hand, we eat foods with a high glycemic index that causes our blood sugars to increase much faster and much higher, our pancreas then tends to release too much insulin too quickly in response. And this in turn causes our body cells to absorb too much sugar, dropping our blood glucose levels below the optimal point. And when our blood sugar levels drop too quickly, we get what is sometimes called a blood sugar crash, causing us to feel tired and sleepy and causing our bodies to crave more sugar in order to bring those levels back up. And this extreme fluctuation of blood sugar levels can cause an unhealthy cycle of high sugar consumption and rapid sugar and insulin spikes, followed by a sugar crash and sugar cravings, which just keep the cycle going. And these sugar and insulin spikes not only lead to a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes in the future, but more immediately can lead to an increase in fat production and fat uptake, which can lead to weight gain. Because you see, since all of our cells need to uptake glucose for energy, insulin receptors can be found in all of our cells. However, there are 3 types of cells in particular that have extra insulin receptors, and those are the liver, the muscle, and the fat cells. At the liver and muscle cells, the extra insulin stimulates more glucose uptake in the formation of glycogen from that glucose. But at the fat cells, insulin also lets in extra glucose, where it stimulates the conversion of glucose into fat. It also stimulates the fat cells to absorb more fat and inhibits the breakdown of fat for energy. Since the amount of insulin released is kind of dependent on blood glucose levels, higher insulin levels caused by sugar spikes means that even more sugar is absorbed by fat cells, and then more fat is stored and more fat is produced, and even less fat is broken down, which is what leads to weight gain. So, in general, then, the key to a healthy carbohydrate consumption is to just aim to improve our diet by eating more high fiber, low GI foods, and maybe using the glycemic index as a guide for controlling both portions and for making better food choices. For example, by just making small changes to our breakfast choices, we can lower the glycemic index in our foods. For example, choosing a high fiber cereal instead of one that is high in simple sugars can make a huge difference. And even though a banana is a healthy choice, an overripe banana will have a higher glycemic index than, say, fresh strawberries. And even your choice of juice can make a difference. Orange juice, especially the ones that are commercially available as opposed to freshly squeezed, can have a higher glycemic index than, say, apple juice. And let's say for dinner, just a simple choice of changing uh, a baked potato for a baked yam will make a huge difference. And what is otherwise an extremely healthy meal choice of salmon with vegetables and a salad. And for example, just making a simple change in my evening snack choice could add up to a huge difference in the way carbohydrates in my diets affect my blood sugar levels. So that's it for today's lesson on carbohydrates. I hope that this lesson may inspire you to grab a piece of fruit instead of some candy next time that you're looking for a snack. In the next lesson, we will talk about the different types of fats and the roles they have in our health. I'll talk to you later.